Austrian Scholars Conference. I was saying that it looks like it was yesterday when we decided that we wanted to have an Austrian Scholars Conference. It was 10 years ago. I remember that the first time, Raquel, people were telling, but a congress in Austrian economics? Who is going to go there? You're going to be 3 people. And over the years we have seen how we feel the spaces that we have, and we have a growing number of communications for the Congress, and people from, not only from Spain, but from scholars from Latin America and other parts of Europe coming to present their research. So I really want to congratulate Raquel and the whole team for what they have been doing over the years. So this year we have the 11th Austrian Scholars Conference, Congreso de Economía Austriaca, and we have the I think 12 communications and several keynote addresses over these 2 days, today and tomorrow. And we have the privilege and the joy of starting today with Peter Boettke, this 11th Austrian Scholars Conference. You all know Peter Boettke, so I'm not going to tell you his CV. You know that he has, he's professor at George Mason University. He directs several programs. I don't know the exact name. I was looking at it, but he has the AT&T chair, and he directs several programs at Mercatus. But the most of the things, whatever I can read, are things that someone else could have. That someone else could have something with a different name but a similar position. What very few people around the world could have is what Pete has done in terms of creating school. Very, very few scholars around the world, very few scholars, not only in the Austrian tradition, but also in any tradition, can say that they have created school. And over the years, Pete Boettke have worked hard, systematically and strategically, in order to see a growing number of scholars that under his direction has been researching and teaching economics, good economics, Austrian economics, sometimes very pure, sometimes eclectic, and have done a tremendous job. And this, as I was saying, is something that very few scholars around the world can say. So it is a privilege and it's a joy to have you here today, Pete, opening this 11th Austrian Scholars Conference, talking about higher economics, political economy, and social philosophy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's a great opportunity for me. I've never been to Spain before, but I have been to UFM. I'm proud sort of honorary member of their faculty at UFM, and I'm absolutely thrilled for UFM to be opening up this campus in Madrid, and all of that. And so I'm very excited about the opportunity to meet many of the Spanish Austrians. I was first alerted to the role of the Spanish language and the development of Austrian economics when I was I had heard about Manuel Ayau, and I met Manuel Ayau when I was an undergraduate through my professor Hans Semholz. Hans Semholz had a very strong relationship with people in Central and South America. A lot of the students that came to do their doctorate with Semholz at Grove City were from Argentina and whatnot, so there was a strong connection. But it was when I was assistant professor at NYU working with Israel Kirzner, and he told me that I have to be paying attention to Jesus Huerta de Soto, who he said is changing the world because he's introducing all of these Austrian works to the Spanish language and making them available. And so when Israel Kirzner tells you something, you pay attention and you listen. And so I've been trying to pay attention and just amazed at the sort of spread of ideas, growth, and vibrancy in the intellectual community here. So, and this relates to this book because what I did in writing this book, which let me just get into right away. So this book is called, not excitingly titled, F.A. Hayek, Economics, Political Economy, and Social Philosophy. But the more important aspect of this book is that it's in this series called Great Thinkers in Economics, which is published by Macmillan. And you have everyone in there from Adam Smith to Alfred Marshall to, Joseph Schumpeter, of course, John Maynard Keynes. And I was asked to write the book about Hayek. It was a big thrill for me to do so. These are, in fact, library books, so it's the library binding, so it has a hefty price tag to it. I did hand out a flyer, which is a promotional flyer from the publisher, which gives you a discount. But if your library, which, by the way, don't think it doesn't do, because one of these, all these presses that publish scientific periodicals, as the online community became more and more vibrant, they knew that they had to change their business model. Otherwise, they were going to, $1,000 for a journal, they're not going to be able to sell it. So what they did was they got libraries to become institutional subscribers. That is that if you're a library, you have an online access to the database that's with Springer, with Elsevier, and all these places like that. Well, as all these publishers have merged, okay, so Springer used to, Kluwer got bought by Springer. Springer then bought up Macmillan. They bought all these different things. You might not know this, but I bet you that if you dig a little bit, Springer Link you belong to, which means you can get the book for paperback for $25. You just have to, they make it difficult, but there's instructions on there and you can figure out how to do it. But you can get the book. It's called a version called My Copy, and it's basically print on demand, but you can get it for $25. Which is more reasonable. I would like to have it out for $10, but again, individual scholars here know this, but we don't have any control over the price. That's set by publishers and whatnot. But what I did in this book, what I'm going to try to do is explain to you is that I didn't write a book about Hayek, the man. Hayek, the man, that's being covered by Bruce Caldwell in a sort of major biography. Caldwell wrote a great intellectual biography of Hayek called Hayek's Challenge. But he is writing a major biography right now on Hayek, which goes into all the ins and outs of his personal life and Hayek the man and why he did things. What I wanted to write a book about was Hayekianism and the evolutionary potential of Hayekianism for you today, especially you who are beginning your intellectual careers, whether or not that's in academics or in think tanks or whatever, people who take inspiration from Hayek that are young people that want to see where they can go with things. By the way, for us older people, Hayek's also inspirational, and I try to explain that because Hayek's own career is defined by lifelong learning. Hayek's most radical ideas came out of his mind when he was 70, 80 years old, not when he was 20 years old. We normally think you're radical when you're 20 and then you become more intellectually conservative, right? But Hayek instead was a constant lifelong learner. And that's one of the things that's really fascinating that I want to try to communicate in the book about that. And then what is that lifelong learning about? And then that's the substance. So if you're a puzzler in economics and political economy and social philosophy, then where does this maturity come out as you go through this? And so, what I try to do in the book is, as I said here, is the evolutionary potential of Hayekian ideas as a research program in the social sciences and humanities today. And I try to show the continuous evolution of Hayek, yet the coherence of Hayek's research program throughout his career, in response to the debates that he was engaged in. So it is a one-sided book in many ways because I'm really talking about how these ideas evolved in response to something, but I'm not giving the response really its due. I'm just using it as a tool for what happened, where he goes from. So it's not like I spent a lot of time, giving Keynes like all of, what Keynesians did. I mean, there's a lot of sense that is involved in Keynes. I'll come to this in a minute, because Hayek, for example, when he was in Britain and Keynes was running in Britain, you got to remember is that between 1920, is there a problem?
Sure.
No. What am I doing wrong? Okay, between 1920 and end of World War I and 1936, when the book was published, only 1 year did the unemployment rate go below 10%. So you're talking about an economy in which everyone's talking about economic ideas and whatnot, but you have, this massive stagnation going on. So that's the background that you have to pay attention to. And that matters, right? And same thing with the sort of whole debates about market socialism and whatnot. What I'm trying to look at is, okay, given those debates, how did Hayek's ideas, take the ideas, mainly from Mises, by the way, in the story I tell, and then how does he respond and react and develop and get a deeper understanding of the way to respond to that? And so, but the book at a meta level, and this is a suggestion to all of you, you're starting a new curriculum in economics here. And, there's a lot to be said about the modern curriculum in economics. There's also a lot of bad things to say about it. One of them is that we've killed the history of economic thought in the United States within economics departments. And we've also killed economic history within economics departments. And one of the questions that you have to ask, and I think that this story sort of tries to lay out, is does economics have a useful past? And does the past have a useful economics? And what's the interaction between those two for the way that we think about doing economics in the future? So if I could have any curricular reform whatsoever that I could do across the world, it would be one, all graduate students would have to be exposed to a year-long of the history of economics, starting from Adam Smith and ending all the way up with Alfred Marshall. After that, they can play around with all the other stuff, but at least they would have that. And then the other thing is that every graduate student would have to write one paper, which was a detailed economic history of a very slice of a particular episode. For those of you who are really into economics, this is going to sound terrible, but it's like everyone has to write like Adam Smith on silver, which no one reads in The Wealth of Nations, right? It's the worst part of The Wealth of Nations. You get reading it, you're like, oh my God, this is terrible. But if you do that, that actually teaches you something about the way economies operate, the way individuals interact with each other, and then if you understand the history of the discipline, you understand the questions that drive people, and you learn about that. And I think that gives us so much more perspective than learning how to work with various different functional forms of things and sophisticated statistics. All right. So what are we asking here about in Hayek in this ongoing continuous debate? And what I do is if you read that title, so is it okay if I move around? Okay, good. All right, I hate standing still. All right, so one of the things that's really cool here is this title. Not my title, this title, Exact Thinking in Demented Times. There's a book by a mathematician at the University of Vienna named Sigmund, who just published a book 2 years ago under that title, Exact Thinking in Demented Times. Because what he's trying to explain is what was going on in Vienna in the first half of the 20th century, and then how the Vienna Circle rose to try to make sense of that crazy world. You got to understand, so I don't know how many of you have ever read this book by Zweig on the world of yesterday, which is, so imagine yourself, put yourself in the world of someone who is born in 1900 and you're in Vienna. What's going on in Vienna? Sort of the pinnacle of civilization. Great art, right? All this stuff is going on. By the time you're a teenager, you're in war. By the time you're an adult, the entire system's falling apart because you're under threat from the Nazis. So, pinnacle of civilization to utter destruction of your world. Right? So, Stephen Zweig, who wrote this book, The World of Yesterday, he ended up by committing suicide, right? Because he's grappling with this loss of a world. This is the demented times, and what I try to show in the book by some measures or whatever is think about the historical background against which Hayek was having these grand debates. So one of them is you look at something like, for example, the economy, unemployment rates. What's going on in unemployment rates during this period of time? What's going on with macro volatility during this time? Of course, Hayek and those were drawn to study macroeconomics because macro volatility. But how about also what's going on is what? World War I, the interwar years, the rise of fascism and communism, the death toll from fascism and communism, but the death toll also from World War I and World War II. Right? So if you're a social scientist, these are demented times because at the same time that all this destruction is going on, we're also going through tremendous technological improvements. Hayek was born into a world where they traveled around the horse and buggy. And he died in a world after we had already put a man on the moon. Right? There's a great line by Mises. It's in the correspondence between Hayek and Mises. Mises' book, Omnipotent Government, comes out. And a Austrian immigrant reviews the book in an American periodical and smashes Mises for being like a laissez-faire nut job, right? And one of the things he tries to say about why Mises is a laissez-faire nut job is that Mises took money in the interwar years from various big moneyed interests. And one of the things that he did was he wanted to make sure that only the moneyed interests had automobiles, and therefore they squashed the little guy. And Mises writes back to Hayek, he says, how many automobiles were there? And what was a little guy? He doesn't know. He says, where did they come up with this nonsense? But it made perfect sense to write that in 1950 America, but it had nothing to do with the world that Mises and Hayek lived in, right? And so Mises says, when is this nonsense going to stop? And, he gets very despondent about it. Part of the backstory on that is that he expects Hayek's Road to Serfdom to have the same reaction that Omnipotent Government has. If you actually look at the dates, they're published in the same year. And Mises thinks that the Road to Serfdom is going to have the same reaction, which is everyone's going to hate it and no one's going to read it. And then why do I have to like keep working my butt off to not have people pay attention to me? And of course Hayek is, skyrocketing, with the success of that, due in a large part to Henry Hazlitt and the Reader's Digest thing and everything. But so that's the subcontext. But what you have to understand is these are kind of strange times. So exact thinking in demented times, that is Hayek's answer is different from the Vienna Circle's answer. Vienna Circle's answer was about scientism. The sort of unity of science approach. The idea that science could work in league with the state. And that's going to actually bring exact thinking. And what Hayek's argument is the exact opposite of that. The sort of what happens is when we actually engage in scientism, when scientism becomes in alliance with the state, as he says in his Nobel Prize address, which by the way, I recommend all of you go back and read, The Pretense of Knowledge. It's not about socialism. It's about the economics profession. And he ends it, think about this, by the way, you just got given the highest honor that this scientific profession can give you. And what he says is that if we don't fix this problem, we are social scientists are going to end up by being tyrants to our fellow citizens and destroyers of civilization. Thank you very much for the award. Go on. Right? He also says in the midst of that we are on the border of becoming charlatans. This is in his Nobel Prize address. Charlatans. Why are we charlatans? Because we demand of a science, economics, things that it cannot achieve, yet we demand that they try to pretend that they achieve it anyway. That game is a game of charlatanism. And so that should make a big sort of indent on you as well. So what does this research program then want to offer to you people? right? That's the idea. How is it that I sort of go through these events, come up with these different ideas, and how do you do economics in the future? If you really take Hayek seriously, and that the entire, the curious task of economics is demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design, what does that mean for you? I'm an economist. What am I going to do? Right? How do I go about doing my tasks? And that's what the book is really about. In the field of money, in the field of capital, in the field of price theory, in particular price theory. I think Hayek doesn't get enough credit for that. Ironically, given the sort of fame and fortune of the use of knowledge in society, but actually the kind of price theoretic economics that Hayek engages in. But also genuine institutional economics, and then I end up by focusing on the reconstruction of liberalism. All right, let's see here. All right, so the way I do this is I go through the arc of Hayek's career. Hayek's career follows a great Jungian archetype. That's one of the reasons why people are drawn to it. You have a meteoric rise, a crashing defeat, and then an intellectual resurrection. This is a Jungian storyline. This is why John Nash's book, The Beautiful Mind, ended up by being such a bestseller. Meteoric rise, crashing defeat, win in the end, okay? There's very few people that you can tell that story about. Most of them are like Michael Jordan, right? Meteoric rise, rise, right? Comes to Barcelona and they have a statue of him, on the wall. 1992, right? It's the whole side of a building, right? And they're like, wow, I guess I am really famous, All right, but, that starts all the way back when he was 18 years old. And, he won the national title by hitting a game-winning shot. Okay? So, these guys are like that. So not many people go through this. Hayek, in fact, at this period of time, often says to his friends at the time, after he starts coming back, he says, I think I'm the only person who went senile and came back again. And he also has other kind of quirky things. He had bad hearing. And so for years he couldn't hear, and then he got new hearing aids, and he was like, oh, now I can hear again, and things like that. And so, but he had this sort of meteoric rise. At the age, when Keynes dies, he turns to his first wife and says, I'm now the most famous economist in the world. And he wasn't wrong. It's hard for us to recapture that. There's one of the things that for you as people that are interested in Austrian economics is what you have to remember is the great accomplishments of the people that went before you compared to the pale comparisons of the people that went after them. All right? That's sort of a hard medicine to swallow. But Henry Hazlitt was the economics editor of the New York Times. He wasn't just the guy who wrote for Human Events. The economics editor of the New York Times. During the Great Depression, the New York Times is a pro-market newspaper in economics. Why? Because of Henry Hazlitt. It's only when Hazlitt, and by the way, the story about Hazlitt being pushed out of the New York Times is kind of quasi-wrong too. What happened was he was against the Bretton Woods Agreement. The editor of the New York Times said, Henry, we can't be against the world. And then, Hazlitt said, well, I'm not going to change my columns. But he didn't get fired. He got 2 years full pay to write economics in one lesson, which when it was published was a bestseller. It was the Freakonomics of its time. So you wouldn't say about Stephen Levitt, oh, like minor crazy figure, right? It is Stephen Levitt, he wrote Freakonomics. He's, they have a radio show for him. Hazlitt was the guy that was on the radio. There wasn't TV. He was on the radio. He did that. He just lived a long time, and he kept writing a long time. So when he's 80, New York Times is no longer interested in hearing about him. He retires in 67. Retires in 67. Who took his place at Newsweek? Not one, but two Nobel Prize winners. Milton Friedman and Paul Samuelson. They had to take his place. So we have to understand this. Ludwig von Mises is a distinguished fellow of the American Economic Association. He got the highest medal of scientific achievement in his hometown, home country of Austria. He's a famous economist. All right, when he was the head guy in Europe for the Rockefeller Foundation and doling out money for scientific, research grants and stuff like that. These people were all major accomplishment figures. They were the elite of the elite, the 1% of the 1% within the academic world. And we too oftentimes try to act as if somehow they were forgotten and not paid attention to. They weren't. They were wrestled with, they were debated, and then people thought, I think, you think, wrongly, that somehow arguments had bested them, that times had bested them. But it's our job to actually remember, how accomplished they were and how they were the fundamental debates there. And so what you have here is you go through this period of time as a progressive research program in the social sciences, and you look at the way that Hayek develops his career, and here's what's going on. Okay, because of that scientism and statism aspects of things, people ended up by forgetting the institutional framework within which economic activity takes place. From Adam Smith all the way up to Alfred Marshall, every single one of those economists understood that economics takes place within a political system, within a legal system, within a social and cultural system. There's no such thing as the economy that's separate from being embedded within society. There's no anti-society view in the classics. There's no anti-society view in the early neoclassicals. Okay? The problem is that classical economics had some difficulties in technical issues of value theory. All right? Now what happened was the historicist jumped onto that and attacked. The response back to a historicist is a very, very simple one. You can understand why this happened in the case. Math is math. The relationship between marginals and averages is true. Whether or not I'm talking about students in a class, right? That if a student wants their average grade to rise, their marginal test grade has to be higher than the average. Right? And if the average is falling, the marginal has to be below it. And that's true whether or not I'm talking about students and their test scores, or whether or not I'm talking about costs in a factory, and it doesn't matter whether or not it's in China or in Madrid. Math is math. I don't need to know all those details. And that's how economists, and the idea that the biggest confusion in the social sciences is when we use the same words to mean different things and different words to mean the same thing. And math gets rid of that. So under that idea, economists sold their souls for a pot of porridge, so to speak. Because what they did was they gave up on the quest for logical soundness and instead settled for validity. And once you go that step, it's very difficult to get off of that step. Why? Keep in mind when they finally made that decision. They made that decision when they thought that they had evolved sophisticated statistical techniques that could sort out from the array of logically valid models those which are empirically meaningful. Is everyone with me? Right? If I have just purely logical, imaginary worlds all over the place, but they're logically coherent, as an economist, how am I going to figure out whether or not I'm dealing with imaginary worlds or the real world? Well, I'm going to submit my imaginary worlds to sophisticated statistical tests. Okay? And then when I do that, I'm going to sort out from the array of valid models those which have empirical oomph. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as Hayek pointed out, and as in the philosophy of science is pointed out, going all the way back to Duhem Quine, is that when you reject, right, when you have a test, the tests are never unambiguous. Precisely because we end up by whether or not we're testing the proposition or the network of statements that make up the proposition, what is the thing that caused the failure in the test? That's in physics. Now how about when we're dealing with economics and we're in a theory of complex phenomena, where ceteris is never paribus? All right, where the frictions don't only prevent the feather from not falling to the ground exactly as the mathematical properties of gravity, but actually are the reason why the feather floats. And what we want to do is study the floating. Precisely because I can walk on this ground is because I have friction between the soles of my feet and my shoes. Now get ready. The only reason why